Hello, my name is Drew Sukup. On behalf of VMUG, I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation, How to Talk and See Your Peers Clearly and Audibly When You're Working Remotely with VMware Horizon and Tenzig, presented by Kevin Greenway, CTO of Tenzig. Thank you for participating in today's webcast and for your continued support in the Global VMUG program. Before we begin, I have 3 quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for on demand. You will receive a follow-up email with the on-demand link, so keep an eye out for that. Second, the Q&A section will be monitored throughout today's presentation. All questions will need to be entered in the question window near the bottom of your GoToWebinar screen. Third, there will be a short online evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast. Please make sure to take a minute and let us know what you thought of today's session and what you might like to see going forward. All right, let's get started. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Drew. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody, and thank you for joining me on today's webcast. As mentioned, I'm Kevin Greenway, and I'll be presenting today's webcast on how to talk and see your peers clearly and audibly when you're working remotely with VMware and Tenzig. Today, we'll be recapping on the tremendous change in strategy due to COVID-19, where employees have been working remotely. And as part of this, we'll discuss the change we've experienced in demand towards unified communications, VoIP and video conferencing solutions in conjunction with VMware Horizon, and how we're working with our mutual VMware customers, new and old, to provide the best platform for this present and new world. We hope you enjoy the webcast, and again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day. We really appreciate it. A further bit of housekeeping, there will be a couple of polls throughout, and I'd really appreciate any attendees answering these to gauge our audience and also improve the webcast today and in future broadcasts. So let's kickstart. So just firstly, a couple of slides about Tenzig for those that aren't familiar with us. So at Tenzig, we're solely focused as a thin and zero client vendor. We've been in business for 16 years and originated in the IBM space before 2009, rebranding as Tenzig, where our primary focus became server-based computing and VDI. We're headquartered in Phoenix, Arizona, with our EMEA office based in the UK. We also have satellite offices around the world with distributors and value-added partners in various locations through North America and the EMEA. And as part of that, we're proud of being a founding VMware Ready partner, and with that, certify our products and employees so we can give qualified and accurate advice around VMware Horizon deployments. So with that, the first poll of the day is, are you using Tenzig Thin or Zero Client? So what I'll do is it's a simple yes or no question. I'd really appreciate everybody's participation, just again to gauge who we have today. And I'll leave it to, looks like we're getting a good percentage of people voting, which is great. Okay, so I'll close that poll and quickly share the results. So it's come up that 63% are or have used Tenzig Thin or Zero Client, so that's a really good result. And then 38% haven't. So hopefully, for those that haven't, you'll be able to see what we're all about today. Moving on. So EUC, VDI, and server-based computing, it's a continually evolving dance floor, and Tenzig's approach to end-user computing is to make your endpoint and its management less complex. Our ethos is all about enabling service teams and architects time to manage your EUC strategy rather than managing the endpoint. The role of an endpoint, specifically a thin or zero client, is to empower the end user to access the benefits of their EUC or VDI deployment without the day-to-day management and maintenance and with minimal fuss. The role of Tenzig is to enable this with powerful and free centralized management using the Tenzig Manager, and this includes in-house EUC-focused R&D to ensure your business is taking advantages of the newest features available, and with the best performing and solely focused support teams who understand more than just the endpoint. So all of this goes into our mission statement, and this is more important than ever before. such a fast pace and quarterly release cycles from VMware, and a big change in strategy specifically this year, it's highly important when coming to the endpoint you aren't just buying a piece of tin and your vendor is there to support you in making the endpoint fit your environment and not the other way around. Tenzing offer a wide range of VMware verified devices, and these are available on tenzing.com as well as the VMware Ready site. We provide x86 based endpoints which offer support for Blast Extreme as well as PC over IP, and also offered is hardware supporting the common codecs such as H.264 and H.265. As a company, we have a major focus firstly on zero and thin clients as mentioned, and that's based on an in-house developed Linux firmware, either NOS as a zero client for VMware deployments, or PeakOS, which is our Linux-based in-client operating system for mixed deployments. And finally, Windows 10 IoT for, again, mixed or hybrid deployments, which specifically require a Windows-based OS. Each of these platforms may run across the hardware range we see pictured on this slide. A wide range of features is supported throughout and in line with VMware developments. We're very much at the forefront of VMware developments using either the stock Linux or Windows client, and as mentioned, this is really critical in today's market and climate. Our in-house sales and pre-sales teams are available for qualification assistance and POC deployments, and as part of this, we offer a market-leading pain-free demo unit trial. So that's the Tenzing housekeeping stuff over with. Let's press on with today's content. So we're seeing a remote working revolution, as everybody's seeing, and whether you talk with friends, co-workers, or a neighbour from a socially distant stance, you'll relate to the sheer volume of employees who were sent home back in early 2020, and now it appears that some companies are at it for the long haul, or at least the short to medium term future. Employees and businesses are also now looking to offer the best of both worlds to their employees for mixed office and remote working. And let's just show some stats on that. So as we can see from the first of these quoted stats, it took 15 years and a growth rate of 2.8% of employees working from home from 2005 to 2020. And there was previously many barriers and concerns over allowing employees to work from home, and doubt over whether it would work and allow a business or employees to be as productive. However, due to those barriers being stripped overnight with national lockdowns, predicted is a growth rate of 493% in 18 months. So we're here today to really see the impact of that and one way in which we can make businesses and employees more productive. Following that shift and increase, we've seen an unprecedented demand for companies and employees to be able to leverage unified communications and video conferencing and VoIP applications using VMware Horizon. These stats back up that demand, which I'm about to show, for the three most requested applications in this segment. So firstly, Microsoft Teams doubled overnight with 44 million active users, and that was from March 2020. So be very interesting to see what that is as of today. Secondly, a major engineering and construction company saw a 129% increase in AV minutes and 143% increase in participants using Skype for Business. And last but not least, as recently as June, Zoom announced a 12-month profit of $27 million. So a huge increase, as you can see, from the year before. So that's all good and well, but how does that relate to the challenges that come from overnight shifting everything from an office environment to home? And we aren't talking necessarily about the social and mental aspects here, which are obviously clearly important, but more the technical challenge of delivering the same level of user experience an employee is accustomed to in an office environment and embracing the big change. So as we've just discussed, employees have increased reliance and dependency on these types of solutions, which from here on in, I'm just going to umbrella as UC solutions. And the key point that we recognize in discussion with prospects and existing customers is that prior to this shift, employees were largely local to the VDI environment, if, for example, on-premises based, and similarly, if cloud-based, appropriate planning and architecture would have taken place to provide the same user experience afforded to on-premise deployments. So shifting users home, IT managers are now at the mercy of home broadband connections. No doubt a vast improvement from several years ago, but definitely a worthy point to consider. The shift to remote working increased the reliance on UC tenfold, and I saw this specifically myself in the early part of lockdown, where previously I chewed over activity or priorities with staff, either over coffee or in meeting rooms, and even today, my main tool has become Teams video calls. So this shift not only created a separation between the employee's VDI environment, but also then with increased reliance and dependency on audio and video, which critically important to mention is of course real-time transport. And worse still, depending on the type of endpoint, for example, a proprietary or zero client, this audio and video may be sent uncompressed. And additionally, now the employee is based at home, there might be a need for two separate paths, which we'll cover in more detail on the next few slides. So I want to use this opportunity just to recap on the different virtual channels we're remoting when we use an endpoint to connect to VMware Horizon. And let's assume here to a published desktop, regardless of whether it's VDI or RDS based. So firstly, the graphics or displays are remoted to the endpoint, including the audio out, and the graphics and audio encoded using Blast Extreme or PC over IP or RDP, dependent on the endpoint and the preference. Secondly, HID, specifically keyboard and mice, are then bridged or sent in a separate virtual channel to the virtual machine. And then thirdly, our USB peripherals are forwarded to the virtual machine, typically via USB redirection. So specifically, our headsets, whether they're USB or analog, and webcams are forwarded to the virtual machine. And remember, both types of peripherals explained here are going to be used for real time. So it's critical that factors including latency, bandwidth, and transport mechanism are optimized. So this brings us to the next poll question, which is, are you using a proprietary? Let me just bring the poll into view. So it's, are you using a proprietary or Terra 2 based zero client? So again, I'd really appreciate any responses here. Again, we're getting a good percentage, which is great. All right, thanks for that. I'll close the poll now, and I'll share the results. So the results, as you can see, that 65% of the attendees are using a proprietary or Terra 2 based zero client. So this is really critical in terms of the information that's being presented today, in terms of options for delivering audio and video. So again, thanks for that participation there. So following the recap, let's now see how this plays out in the real world, or at least pre-COVID-19. So in this first example, the zero client being based locally on premises to a VMware Horizon deployment. So the endpoint connects to the VMware Horizon environment, and due to connecting via LAN or worst case WAN, there's minimal latency and bandwidth is plentiful to remote all of those virtual channels that we saw in the previous slide, and that includes audio and webcam. Once the endpoint, in this example, again, the same traditional zero client, is sent to a home location, that's where things change. So no longer are we local to the VDI environment, and additionally, we have to factor in the potential that our audio and webcam are being forwarded natively via USB redirection, requiring, as we'll see in the next slide, serious amounts of bandwidth. And this is true regardless of connecting to an on-premise or cloud environment, as we can see. So the reality of forwarding audio and webcams via USB redirection is that it's sent uncompressed. And this can result in upwards of 60 to 80 megabits per second for remoting webcams. And in a LAN or WAN, or traditional on-premise environment, this will largely go undetected. But from a working environment, not so, with the fact that, again, we have to factor in latency, jitter, and any degree of packet loss. So there are solutions available, and I guess we'll cover them in terms of order of optimization and preference. So firstly, the optimal method is using a UC or VDI optimized solution, and these are often provided directly via the UC vendor in partnership with VMware and Tenzig. For example, as is in the case of Zoom, which we'll explain later, and alternatively, VMware will offer them as a direct feature within both the Horizon agent and Horizon client, as is the case with Skype for Business or Microsoft Teams. But importantly here, check your endpoint hardware and OS or firmware supports such optimization features. So broadly, the concept is the same. The UC application, for example, Microsoft Teams or Zoom, is installed to the virtual machine running the Horizon agent, and depending on the requirements, this is a VDI specific version of that application or a minimum version as stated by the requirements. And this includes the necessary communication channels to communicate with the endpoint where the headsets and webcams are physically plugged and connected. On the endpoint, this will run either a standalone plugin, as is the case, for example, with Zoom, or the feature is built directly into the VMware Horizon client, as is the case with Skype for Business and now Microsoft Teams. The endpoint plugin then communicates directly with webcams and headsets and provides the direct encoding and media path for audio, video, and in some cases screen sharing. So as far as the user is concerned, the UC application continues to be used as it would in a normal desktop environment, and features such as chat, file sharing, and also signaling to and from the UC solution continue to be handled directly by the UC application, which again resides in the virtual desktop. However, where an audio video call and in some cases screen sharing occurs, this is redirected to the endpoint entirely. And this occurs using a virtual channel where the UC application communicates with the endpoint plugin and initiates those media streams directly. So as you can imagine, there's some really good benefits to discuss here. Firstly, optimal user experience, since the media is encoded and routed locally to the user. Since the media is no longer forwarded to the virtual machine, as is in the case of USB redirection, the hairpinning effect that occurs is eliminated, which is otherwise a factor in adding latency, which again is exacerbated in a remote working situation. And the plugins will use the same native audio and video codecs as the regular desktop solution without further conversion or compression, which can in some cases again add to increased latency. And then last but not least, VDI overhead is reduced, since audio and video encoding and decoding is performed directly at the endpoint, as well as, again, mentioned screen sharing where supported. So these are really often large contributors of quite significant overhead, which when moved to the endpoint results in less vCPUs having to be assigned to virtual machines. So as we can see in this example, the graphics, and by the way, this example is specifically using the UC optimized plugin. So the graphics and regular audio out and HID, again, the keyboard and mouse, continue to be remoted between the VMware environment and the user's remote home office location, as we saw in the earlier slide. But the difference is that the audio and video and obviously screen sharing takes place directly at the endpoint, and this is encoded and compressed, again using those native codecs I mentioned, towards the telephony UC solution. So for example, with Teams, it goes directly towards the Teams transport servers or towards a direct peer if making a peer-to-peer call. An additional benefit of this solution is that, as we see, the VMware Horizon and UC solution are often segregated. So, for example, the VMware environment could well be on premises, and the telephony UC solution is typically cloud-based, as is the case for things like Zoom and Teams. So in this mode, since we're separating both of those channels, traffic is routed directly, which again eliminates that hairpin effect where they would otherwise go towards the VMware Horizon environment where the published desktop is located, and then effectively down to wherever the UC solution is hosted. An alternative and again long-standing feature of Tenzig VMware Ready Linux and Windows-based endpoints is RTAV, or as it's short, real-time audio and video. And this is generally used in the event where those previously mentioned UC optimized methods are not available. For example, if the UC solution you are using is not yet VDI optimized, and this feature is available on Tenzig x86 Linux and Windows-based endpoints running VMware Horizon clients. And similarly to the previous solution, the video and audio are encoded locally at the endpoint, but where it differs is those streams are also then compressed and forwarded between the endpoint and the virtual machine. So again, let's just explore the benefits to RTAV. So again, a significant reduction in bandwidth to the alternative, which is effectively USB redirection, with the fact that the audio and video are both compressed. A key point to RTAV is that it's agnostic to the UC solution, and this works by the fact that the audio and the video devices are being presented into the virtual machine as dummy devices, for example, into the Windows virtual desktop. Secondly, parameters such as frame rate and video resolution can be configured dependent on the user requirements in the environment. So, for example, for poorly connected environments, we could leave it at 360p, or where we have specific endpoints that are able to encode and also plenty of bandwidth available, we can tune it up to, for example, 720p for those webcams. And finally, since this is a long-standing feature, a wide array of headsets and webcams are supported, and I have a more in-depth slide on that later. So as that previous slide we saw of the impact of remoting webcams and headsets via USB redirection, let's just compare that to doing the same thing with RTAV. So remember, using USB redirection, that can be upwards of 80 megabits per second. However, if we do the same thing via RTAV, you can see the results that we're using upwards to 800 kilobits per second. So massive savings there with RTAV. And let's just summarize the same thing here when we're using RTAV. So again, the graphics and audio out or audio output, sorry, continue to be remoted between the virtual machine and the Horizon client, and then the audio in and the video webcam are encoded at the endpoint and then compressed and forwarded to the virtual machine where the Horizon agent resides that again run the RTAV feature. The audio and video are then encoded and compressed at the virtual machine, and like in this example, audio and media streams will traverse then not from the endpoint but from the virtual desktop towards Teams, either again the cloud services if we're participating in meetings, or similarly Microsoft Teams peers. So this method is recommended really where the UC optimization plugin doesn't exist, or as it stands currently today, where, for example, Microsoft Teams optimization is only supported on Windows-based endpoints. So here we see a summary of audio and video features supported by 3 common thin and zero client platforms. For any other platforms that you don't see listed here, please check with your vendor, and ultimately for Linux and Windows, I specifically referenced Tenzig-based endpoints here. So again, they might differ for other equivalent vendors there. So firstly, we look at the forwarding methods available, again including USB redirection, which as we can see is available to all three platforms. And importantly, this is again important for those that selected yes on the Terra 2 clients. You've got this feature here of USB audio, which, although doesn't support RTAV, as I've mentioned in the slide, there is an equivalent feature called USB audio, which works very similarly by separating out the audio either as analog or USB audio into a separate stream. Where it differs against RTAV is that it only does that for audio and not for webcams. And obviously, as its name implies, with USB audio. So yes, to summarize, you can compress audio through Terra 2 client, but for webcams, they unfortunately will only forward through USB redirection. We then look at the listed UC optimized solutions, and these can be found on the VMware Horizon client feature matrix, which I've linked to up here, as well as the Teradici site, which refers to the USB audio feature that I mentioned. So as you can see, none of the UC solutions listed offer optimized support for Terra 2 clients, and again, as such, USB audio would be the recommended forwarding approach here, but without any compressed support for webcams. For the Linux and Windows-based Horizon clients, we can use this table to determine if those optimization plugins exist for either platform, and also note that like in the example I've already given, actually let's use another one. Yeah, so sorry, for Microsoft Teams, for example, we can see that Teams optimization is supported on Windows-based clients, but not currently on Linux. That will come in future. And similarly, some optimization plugins only exist for VDI desktops, not for RDS-based desktops. So that is quite an important point. So for any others not currently listed, please double check with us at Tenzig, but otherwise assume that ultimately you can fall back to RTAV or USB audio, dependent on your platform. So what we're going to do now is to dig more closely into those top three, and these are the top three that we've seen throughout the pandemic. Now, I did mention Skype for Business earlier as well, and this is a really well-established feature that's been present for a few years already. So I'm not including anything on Skype for Business because many businesses are now moving towards Microsoft Teams. But if you do have any requests for Skype for Business, do feel free to write some questions, and we can cover those either at the end, as well as perhaps a separate one-to-one session after the webcast. So I've already alluded to Microsoft Teams optimization existing for VMware Horizon, and it's a very recent feature that came in either in version 8 of Horizon, or as it's now known, 2006. And this specifically requires the Horizon Agent 2006 version, as well as the equivalent Windows Horizon 2006 client version. And as it says, VDI only at this point in time. As I mentioned, for those interested in Linux clients, the current anticipated date from VMware is the first half of 2021. But as you can appreciate, we're communicating very regularly with VMware to get updates on that. There's a lot of interest in that area. So as of now, if you are looking for Teams optimization with VMware Horizon, then Windows Horizon Client is the option, and we do, as mentioned earlier, have plenty of platforms to satisfy that. So the optimization is based on WebRTC, and the components similar to the Skype for Business package before it are integrated into both the Horizon Agent, which is part of the HTML5 feature set, and also the Windows Horizon Client. And the regular Microsoft Teams desktop client is either installed into persistent or non-persistent form, and requires a minimum version of the Teams desktop version that's listed here. And I would ask you to very strongly refer to that, because through the deployments we've seen a lot of customers that haven't had that minimum or even recommended version. So the real recommendation here is to work at least with that, but preferably in your deployment, point towards this link here to get the recommended version, because it is evolving constantly. The only other point to mention here is that, and I already touched on this, but it's at this point only supported with VDI deployments and not with RDS-based desktops or applications. Once you've installed those components, ensure you have enabled the two mentioned GPOs against the virtual machines or OUs. And one big tip that we found when initially deploying this and setting this up was to remember to include the VMware HTML5 features GPO, and I'll cover that in the demo, as well as the media optimization. That at the time wasn't overly clear in documentation, but without those two things being set, the optimization wasn't and isn't successful. And we do have our own document on the Teams optimization as well, which we can share if required. And finally, we do strongly recommend, especially in the case of video calls, to high resolution. So the currently maximum supported resolution is 720p, to go for either the Tenzig 5810Q or 6010Q in order to provide those high resolution calls. So let's just take a moment to go over the Teams architecture before we touch into a demo. So as mentioned, the regular Teams desktop is installed to the virtual machine, and this continues to perform, as we can see, the signaling, authorization, and non-audio video content such as chat and file sharing directly to cloud services. But then for voice and video streams, including the webcams and screen sharing, this is offloaded to the calling service media stack, which signals towards the endpoint, as we can see, and the WebRTC stack, which performs the encoding and media transport directly. So again, this is part of the VMware Horizon client that sits on the thin client. And the video stream is then overlaid back into the VMware Horizon session, as we can see, as if it's being encoded and streamed directly on the virtual machine. But importantly, this video at this point is directed directly towards the Teams cloud services and completely separate from the virtual machine or the VDA. So I'm going to take the opportunity to, if all is working well, give you a quick demonstration of firstly Teams. So just to explain what I've got here, I have the Tenzig manager, which is connected to a couple of endpoints just to enable me to do the demos. These are located at my office. I'm currently working from home today. So the first endpoint we're going to connect to is the 6010Q. So this is the Windows 10 IoT-based client. Let me just, might have to reconnect these sessions. They've probably been idle for some time. So as we can see, this is, let me put this into full screen. This is running the Windows 10 IoT client, which we can customize, but this is effectively a stock unit that we're looking at. This is actually connected at the moment into my virtual desktop. So let me quit out of that, and then I can show you what I want, the focus of what I want to show. So what I've done is I've opened Performance Monitor on the endpoint, and what we're looking at here is the processor, which we can see in blue here, as well as the VMware remoting process. So this is effectively the VMware client, but the remoting process that deals with all of the graphics decoding, and in this case, the WebRTC client. So as you can see at the moment, that is that's completely idle, but we'll be able to flip back to that later to see that the video is offloaded to the endpoint. So we're then going to go back into the Horizon client and connect back to that Windows desktop. And again, on the desktop, what we can see is the same equivalent performance monitor here. So this cyan color here is the overall processor. It did ramp up as we initially connected to it, but now it's going relatively idle. And then what we're looking at here are the Teams processes that, again, at the moment are idle, with the fact that we're not doing anything as yet in Teams. Now, as mentioned, the first thing I want to demonstrate is those GPOs. So they're under the VMware View agent configuration, and they're within the VMware HTML5 features area. Now, the important one that, again, wasn't that well documented is the kind of global enable VMware HTML5 features. So as you can see, that one has to be enabled, and then the specific GPO for Teams is under the VMware WebRTC redirection features. So it's the enable media optimization for Microsoft Teams. So both of those GPOs have to be set, as well as the Teams desktop application meeting that minimum requirements, as well as running the Horizon 2006 agent and the Horizon 2006 client. Now, if we go ahead and launch Microsoft Teams, the few things I want to demonstrate here is, firstly, how can you verify that Teams is running in an optimized format? So the easiest way to do this is in the Teams desktop application. You go to About and Version, and as we can see, that not only lists the version of Teams that we're running, but also the fact that it's running through VMware Media Optimized. So that confirms that the virtual channel is active. And similarly, if we go to Settings and then Devices, we can basically see both the audio and the microphone input that's physically connected to the endpoint, as well as the webcam. And again, there's my desk in the office, currently empty. If we then go and just let's just join just a meeting, or let's just leave it there, and you should then be able to immediately see the effect if we go back to Performance Monitor, with a slight change here, with the fact that the processor usage, again, the cyan color here, is relatively low. And similarly, Teams, for example, if we go through those Teams processes, we can see the average is very, very low, even though the fact that we've, in effect, already encoding this particular webcam on the endpoint. Now, if we minimize that for a moment and then look towards the endpoint, we can again clearly see here that it's the endpoint that's doing the work. So the VMware remoting process has counted up, as well as the overall processor. And again, that would be a similar thing as more peers joined into that particular meeting. So that's the first demo for, in this case, Microsoft Teams. We'll then minimize that, and then we'll be coming back to this in a moment to cover Zoom as well. So Zoom is another really hot topic, and this is supported for VMware Horizon for both Linux and Windows 10 IoT-based clients. Now, specifically in Linux, as we can see, it's only supported in our NOS64V operating system. So that's basically anything that ends with 48V or 48QV as far as our model denominations. But if you need any assistance with validating this, again, either ask the Q&A at the end, or you can reach out to support. So for now, the Zoom add-on is effectively a separate firmware, which is sent towards the endpoint using the Tenzing manager, but we're imminently about to release the standardized production firmware, which includes the Zoom optimization that'll go out from the factory. But either or, it's available either by download from our website or as a factory fitted option. So firstly, the Zoom optimization is supported for both VDI and RDS-based desktops. So it's a little bit different to Teams in the fact that we support both VDI and RDS-based desktops. And again, it's supported through Blast Extreme or PC over IP. The one limitation here is the fact that it's not supported currently with published applications. So do be aware of this. And I think the biggest gotcha or the biggest FYI for Zoom is, again, we see this as a common mistake, is that you must install the Zoom VDI client and not the regular Zoom desktop client that you download from zoom.com. So this can be downloaded from the link I've put in at the slide at the bottom. And again, as Drew said earlier, you will get access to these slides. But if you just Google Zoom VDI, that will get you access to the Zoom VDI desktop client. And then as far as the Zoom client plugin, this again may need to be installed dependent on either the firmware version you have for Linux and also the Windows-based endpoint that you've got, whether it's on there by default or not. And exactly as per Teams, we do recommend the Tenzig 5800Q or 6000Q if performing video calls with, again, high resolution. It's really very often overlooked just the amount of CPU power that's required to do video encoding and decoding. So it is a really critical part here. So let's take a closer look now at the Zoom VDI architecture. So as mentioned, the Zoom client for VDI is installed to the desktop, and that again is either RDS based or VDI, and the media in the form of audio and video is offloaded to the endpoint, which runs the Zoom client plugin. The audio and video is then encoded and transported directly on the endpoint direct to Zoom, as we can see. And the video feed, exactly like we saw with Teams, is then overlaid back into the VDI session, again, as if it's running locally as per a regular Zoom desktop call that you'd run on a laptop or a PC or iPhone, etc. The Zoom client for VDI, which runs on the virtual desktop, continues to perform signaling, authentication, and instant messaging to Zoom Cloud MMR services, exactly as we saw in the case of Teams, sorry. And then the thin client also then routes directly video towards Zoom Cloud MMR services. So as we've seen in the other services, all of the telephony side of things from Zoom in this case, including again the audio and video, it effectively bypasses the VMware Horizon environment and goes straight towards the Zoom Cloud services. So that's really the key thing. So again, let's give a quick demo of Zoom to kind of build on what we saw before. So we use the same endpoint for this particular demo. Let me just put this back to full screen. Again, the VMware remoting process at the moment, there's a bit of activity just with the fact that we've got an idle desktop connected. We're also monitoring the Zoom client plugin process. So where that differs against Teams is where Teams runs within the VMware Remote MKS process because it's part of the Horizon client. Zoom runs as a separate process on the client, and as we'll see, as we saw with Teams, once we set up into a call, that will then offload to the endpoint through the Zoom VDI plugin. So if we then go back towards the same desktop again, same sort of thing here. In the performance monitor, we're measuring the Zoom VDI desktop process usage on the virtual desktop. So I'm going to open the Zoom VDI application. And as I mentioned before, that is specifically the Zoom VDI application, not the regular Zoom desktop application. But as you can see, it looks the same. And again, the things that we can do here to verify that it's functional, a couple of things. we can go towards the settings and into statistics, where we can see the VDI plugin that's currently installed, as well as the version of the desktop and the fact that the VDI is connected. And this is really neat as well, with the fact that we can see the CPU and memory usage for the endpoint. So again, this is specifically measuring the endpoint at this point in time in terms of the overall usage and specifically the Zoom usage as well. And when we participate in calls with Zoom, we also get stats in terms of audio, video, and screen sharing. And similar to what we saw in Teams, the webcam is forwarded directly to the endpoint, and similarly, so is the audio. So if I go in here and we create a new meeting, typical demo, let me just try that again. Looks as if it's not encoding on the video. Let me just quit out of Teams for a moment, just in case there's anything still left on there. Yeah, so I still had the call active in Teams. Right, let's give that a go. May have to quit and restart the Zoom application. Yeah, so it's working now. Okay, so join with audio. And again, the same sort of effect now, that if we look at the performance counters, we can see that Zoom, as we can see a maximum and average, it's really doing nothing at all, even though we've effectively got a video call in progress. And also the overall processor count is very low as well. And then just quit out of that. Minimize that, and then if we go back to the endpoint again, we can now see that the Zoom plugin, you can see, is taking a substantial amount of overhead. So these are measured by cores. This is a quad core client, so the reality is it's about 25% of processor overhead at the moment, just in terms of rendering that Zoom plugin. So that's Zoom. And then finally, we'll just do a quick demo then on the RTAV, which again is very commonly used still. So as I said before, this has been around for years, really since VMware Horizon 5.3. And where it was previously available as feature packs, it's more recently been included natively, both within the Horizon agent and also, as mentioned, on Linux and Windows-based endpoints. So we've supported this across the board on our x86 endpoints for many years. The key thing to note here is when you're installing the Horizon agent, dependent on the version you're installing, make sure that you're including the real-time audio and video feature. And secondly, webcams and headsets then appear in session as a VMware virtual webcam or audio device. For Linux clients, ensure the following. Firstly, webcam and audio devices are excluded under USB redirection, and where webcams are specifically concerned, ensure UVC cameras are supported and recommended are specifically Logitech webcams. So I have included this link here. Again, Logitech generally work without fail, but if you are using any other types of webcams, there is this well-updated list of UVC supported webcams as a guide. And sorry, also, as I mentioned before, you then can adjust things like the webcam encoding size, etc., as you'll see during the demo. And as far as headsets are concerned, they can be specified again locally on the Tenzig client, as you'll see. And we've got a good relationship with all the headset vendors, including Sennheiser, Plantronics, Jabra, and Logitech. So again, very well supported feature. So then we'll come across to the final demo of the day, and that will then lead us to the Q&A. So what we'll do now is we'll switch our attention towards the Linux-based client. Just Make sure I did quit out of that desktop. So as mentioned, this time we're going to connect into the NOS-based Zero client and I'll be able to give you a demonstration of how to configure RTAV on the endpoints. Again, with the Tenzing Manager, we can configure bulk of these settings remotely, and we can auto deploy these parameters as well to other clients. But this is just giving you a local demo. So firstly, in the audio settings, this is where we can configure parameters such as the preferred audio device as well as the microphone in this case. So in this particular case, this is going through the webcam, as we saw on the Windows-based endpoint. And then we can turn on features like USB audio hot plug as well. As I mentioned as well, do make sure that if we go to USB devices, that you are excluding, as I am here, webcam video devices. So they definitely don't want to be forwarded through USB redirection to benefit from RTAV. And then in VMware Horizon, we have specifically in RTAV camera settings where we can tune, as I mentioned, things like the frame rate and the camera width and height to suit your needs. And this control panel, of course, can all be locked down from users as well. So I'm just going to go in and connect to that same desktop that we saw before. Connect to that same desktop. And as the final demo, let's just open Teams. So in this particular demo, we're going to open Teams, but the key difference is that it's not going to be working optimized as it was when we were using the Windows endpoint. So it's going to basically just fall back to RTAV. And again, you should see, let's just clear this so we start with a clear picture. We should see the difference here with the fact that when we do a video call in the non-optimized format, the processor usage is going to be higher on the virtual machine. So if we go into the same area where we were before in terms of about and version, we can see that the VMware media is not connected. If we then go to settings and go to devices, we can see that instead of the native audio and webcam, it's the virtual devices that I mentioned before. So again, these are things that are forwarded through the virtual channel, specifically the RTAV virtual channel. But as we can see, that is still forwarding that particular webcam. It is obviously on a physical different endpoint in the office, so it's not quite in focus as the other one was. And again, if we just go ahead and let's go and join a meeting again, and then this time we again should see that the processor usage for things like Teams is going to be ultimately higher at this point because of the fact that the virtual desktop is doing that encoding work, and on the physical endpoint side of things, there's going to be similar load here with the fact that we're also encoding on the endpoint. So that's the overall processor usage on that particular endpoint, where again we're encoding the webcam on the endpoint, forwarding it to Teams. Teams is then re-encoding that video call to, in this case, the Teams cloud services. So hopefully those demos give you a good overview of the differences of using the UC and VDI optimized solutions and or RTAV. And I'm sure there'll be some questions to be had, so I'll happily answer those in the next section. So let me just come back to the PowerPoint. And before we hit to the Q&A, let me just add in the final poll of the day, which is, are you interested in a complimentary Tenzing demo client? So again, if you could answer this, I'd really appreciate it. That's great. So good percentage of people have voted here today, which has been fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. And then I'll look towards some questions. So the first question is, want to make sure I heard correctly, is RTAV only available for x86 based endpoints? Yes, it is for both Linux and Windows based endpoints. So RTAV again specifically isn't available on the Terra 2 based clients. As an alternative, you can again leverage USB audio, but that's just specifically for audio. Webcams will still go through the USB redirection route. There's a question here about Cisco Webex. At the moment, Cisco Webex, as far as VDI, isn't yet supported. We are in very early discussions with Cisco on that, but again, that currently isn't supported. But watch this specific space on that. There's another very good question here about the fact that there are VDI feature limitations in the VDI optimization versions of the applications, which makes the business execs a little mad. What are your suggestions? Try the full client with Blast and hope it works well. So I think that is a good point, and some of those limitations include, if you're referring to something specifically like Teams, the fact that the experience is slightly different at the present time. If, for example, you're doing a meeting, so in a meeting where you're using the regular desktop version of Teams, you will in effect see a number of different peers who are present within that meeting. However, with the VDI optimization solution currently, it's just the most prominent speaker. These are things that are prone to develop over time. I think it's fair to say that Teams specifically, was a direct, or at least the optimization front was a direct result of the challenges that were faced due to the COVID pandemic. And I think certainly our experience of it has been the fact that although there is a slight compromise at this point in time, the option of having that versus not is still more compelling. I think if you are to move away from that, then for sure you can look at RTAV, but again, then you just have to factor in the fact that you've got the endpoint and the virtual desktop that's doing the encoding work, and also the fact that the traffic is being directed from the endpoint to the virtual desktop. So again, if you factor those things in, you can take it into account. But like I say, this is effectively quite an early release of the Teams optimization at this point, and from what we're hearing, we do expect this to evolve, hopefully sooner than later. There's another question here, which is very good, about RTAV versus VMware optimized multimedia. So what kind of differences in bandwidth can we expect? Again, it depends on both the solution and the type of call that you're participating in, whether it's a peer-to-peer call or whether it's a meeting call. But largely, the bandwidth is, at least from what we've found, it's very similar. The key difference is, again, is that where RTAV, that bandwidth is directed between the endpoint and the virtual desktop environment. In the case of the optimization, that bandwidth is directed directly towards the cloud services. So again, summarize, the bandwidth, at least from our experience, has been very similar, but it's just the fact that it's directed to different destinations depending on whether optimization is used or RTAV is used. We've also got what is the ETA on Linux-based Teams optimization? That at the moment is first half of 2021, but as mentioned, we're working with VMware regularly to get updates as regularly as we can on that. And then I think the third and final question before I hand back to Drew, is the Microsoft Teams optimization only supported with Horizon 8? Yes, that is the minimum requirements, that Horizon 8 is a minimum requirement, and that's specifically the Horizon agent, with the fact that it contains that calling stack in combination with the Horizon Client 8 or 2006 version as well. So if there are any follow-on questions after this, feel free to follow up after the webinar. Thanks again, everybody, for your participation. I hope you've enjoyed it. And Drew, I'll hand back to you.
Well, great. Thank you, Kevin. I'm sure I'm speaking for me and all the attendees that we really appreciated it. And thank you for taking this time to speak with us today. As a reminder, you will receive a follow-up email with the on-demand link from today's webcast. To find out more about the VMUG webcast program, visit vmug.com and check out the education page. Please make sure to complete the short online evaluation that will pop up as you exit the webcast, and let us know how today's session went. And from all of us here at VMUG, thank you and have a great rest of your day.